Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
I've been called many things in my life, but if you ask Mark's family, they'll tell you that my defining trait, my core identity, the one thing that sums me up as a human being is that I am cheap. Not frugal, not practical, not financially responsible, just cheap, as if being mindful of money is some kind of personal failure. Mark's family, the Hawthorns, come from old money, the kind of wealth that allows people to live in a fantasy world where consequences are for other people and where spending lavishly is seen as a sign of character rather than recklessness. They were the type who would scoff at coupons, roll their eyes at budgets, and laugh at the idea of cost-conscious living. And me? I was the unwelcome dose of reality they had never asked for. I still remember the first time Patricia, Mark's mother, called me cheap. It was early in our relationship, back when I was still naive enough to think I could win them over if I just tried hard enough. We were at a fancy brunch, one of those places where the menu doesn't have prices because if you have to ask, you shouldn't be there, and when the check came, Patricia had conveniently forgotten her wallet. William, Mark's father, patted his pockets with a dramatic sigh, claiming he must have left his card in the car. Mark and I had just moved into our first apartment, and money was tight, so when they all turned expectantly to me, I hesitated for just a second before pulling out my card. I had paid, of course, I wasn't about to embarrass myself, but that hesitation, that split second of calculating the cost in my head, had sealed my fate. "She's careful with money," Patricia had said, her voice dripping with amusement. That's a polite way of putting it. From that moment on, it was a running joke. Every time we went out, every holiday, every family gathering, there was always some offhand remark, some barely concealed jab about my supposed stinginess. It wasn't even about actual financial hardship. Mark and I were comfortable, not rich, but stable. It was about control. It was about making sure I knew that no matter how much money I made or how hard I worked, I would never truly belong in their world. So when Thanksgiving rolled around, I already knew how the evening would go. We would sit at their ridiculous, oversized dining table, sipping from crystal glasses while Patricia made passive-aggressive comments disguised as polite conversation. William would nod along, barely listening, and Mark, sweet, spineless Mark, would pretend not to notice. Dinner was in full swing when Patricia turned to me, her eyes glinting with the anticipation of another little game at my expense. "So, Sarah," she said smoothly, setting down her fork with a practiced elegance that made it clear she had rehearsed this moment. "We're all planning a family trip to St. Bart's this year. First class, of course. We figured you and Mark could cover our flights." She said it so casually, so effortlessly, as if she were asking me to pass the salt. The table went silent, everyone waiting for my response. I could feel Mark's gaze on me, practically begging me not to start a fight, but I was done playing along with their nonsense. I smiled, took a slow sip of my wine, and said, "Oh, that sounds nice. But we won't be paying for that." Patricia blinked, momentarily thrown off by my lack of hesitation. "Oh, come on, dear," she said, her voice taking on that sickly sweet tone she used whenever she was pretending to be reasonable. "You and Mark are doing well. Besides, we cover so many family expenses." William chuckled, shaking his head as he reached for his drink. "Of course, she won't," he said, laughing under his breath. Sarah's always been practical. And there it was. Their favorite insult, wrapped in a thin layer of condescension, just enough to maintain plausible deniability. I could have let it go. I had let it go so many times before. But something about the way Patricia was looking at me, something about the smugness in William's voice, made me snap. I set down my glass with deliberate care, folded my hands on the table, and met Patricia's gaze head-on. "You know what's funny?" I said, my voice light, almost conversational. "If I'm so cheap, why do you keep asking me for money?" The silence was deafening. Patricia's smile faltered, but only for a second before she recovered. "It's not about that, dear," she said smoothly. "It's about family. We take care of each other." "Do we?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks a lot like you expect me to take care of you while you keep making jokes at my expense. Mark cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably in his seat, but I wasn't done. I had swallowed my pride one too many times for these people, and I wasn't going to do it anymore. Patricia gave a soft, breathy laugh, as if I were being ridiculous. "Oh, Sarah," she said, shaking her head. "You're taking this all too personally." "Maybe," I said, shrugging. "But you know what? I'm okay with that." And with that, I picked up my wine glass and took another long, slow sip, letting the conversation die a natural death. Later that night, as I was heading toward the guest room, I overheard Patricia talking to Mark's aunt in hushed tones. "She's lucky to be in this family," she was saying, her voice dripping with disdain. "Mark could have done so much better, married someone with means." I stopped in my tracks, the words slicing through me like a blade. It wasn't even surprising, not really, but hearing it out loud, hearing it confirmed so blatantly, sent a cold, simmering rage through me. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the closed door, my fists clenched at my sides. Then I exhaled, squared my shoulders, and walked away. One day, I thought, they're going to regret underestimating me. It started with little things, small details that might have gone unnoticed by someone who wasn't paying attention, but I had spent too many years watching Patricia and William pretend to be something they weren't to miss the subtle shifts in their behavior. Patricia, who prided herself on being the queen of high society, suddenly canceled her annual spring charity brunch, a tradition she had never missed in all the years I had known her. She claimed it was because she was too busy, but I knew that was a lie, because Patricia lived for those events, for the chance to stand in the center of a room filled with people who envied her wealth, her status, her effortless ability to make others feel small. Then there was William, whose beloved Mercedes, the one he had once refused to let his own son borrow, was suddenly in the shop more often than not. This was a man who replaced his cars the moment they developed so much as a scratch, someone who took pride in never driving this same vehicle for more than 2 years. Yet now, he was making excuses, laughing it off, saying he was waiting for the right time to upgrade, as if that had ever stopped him before. At first, I thought maybe it was just a coincidence, just the normal ups and downs of life that even the wealthy had to endure from time to time, but then I started noticing other things. Like how Patricia had stopped mentioning the country club, or how their usual extravagant dinner parties had become noticeably less frequent. When they did host, the guest list was smaller, the champagne a little less expensive, the jewelry she wore just slightly less ostentatious. It was subtle, but it was there, and once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Mark didn't notice at first, or maybe he just didn't want to. He had spent his whole life believing that his parents were untouchable, that no matter what happened in the world, the Hawthorns would always land on their feet. Even when William started calling him more frequently, his voice quieter, his tone more clipped, Mark brushed it off, saying his father was just stressed about some investments. One night, as we were lying in bed, I turned to him and asked, "You think they're in trouble?" Mark frowned, his brow furrowing in that way it always did when he was trying to convince himself of something. "Nah," he said after a moment, shaking his head. "They're fine. They always are." I just smiled, because I knew better. I knew that the cracks in the perfect facade they had worked so hard to maintain were growing wider by the day, that the empire they had built on arrogance and entitlement was starting to crumble beneath them, and that sooner or later, they were going to have to face the consequences of their own recklessness. And when that day came, I knew exactly where I was going to be, standing right there, watching it all fall apart. The call came on a Tuesday, interrupting the quiet of our evening like an unwanted guest who refused to take a hint, and from the way Mark's face fell as he listened to his father's voice, I knew something was terribly wrong. He stood there, phone pressed to his ear, nodding along even though William couldn't see him, his other hand rubbing at his temple as if trying to ward off the headache that was surely forming. I didn't need to hear the words to know what had happened, because I had seen the signs, had watched the slow, inevitable decline of the Hawthorne name in real time, had known that this day was coming long before they had even considered the possibility. When he finally ended the call and turned to me, his expression was carefully blank, but his voice betrayed him, thick with something I couldn't quite place. "They lost the house," he said, as if he still couldn't believe it, as if the idea of his parents losing anything, let alone the grand estate they had once lorded over us, was beyond comprehension. I didn't say anything at first, just leaned back in my chair and let the words settle between us, let him sit with the weight of them the way I had sat with the weight of their insults for years. That evening, just as I knew she would, Patricia showed up at our doorstep, looking more disheveled than I had ever seen her, her perfectly styled hair slightly out of place, her designer coat wrinkled as if she had been clutching at it for comfort. But it was the mascara streaked down her face that truly caught my attention, because Patricia Hawthorne did not cry, at least not in a way that anyone could see, not unless it served a purpose, not unless it was carefully calculated for maximum effect. I stood in the doorway, blocking her path, making no move to invite her inside as she wrung her hands and let out a trembling breath, her lips pressing together in an effort to control the emotions that had suddenly become too much for her to bear. "We just need a place for a while," she said, her voice small, unfamiliar, stripped of the usual condescension that laced her every word. I stared at her, taking in the pathetic sight before me, the woman who had spent years making me feel like I wasn't good enough, who had looked down on me with thinly veiled disdain, now standing on my doorstep, desperate, vulnerable, completely at my mercy. It was almost funny, in a twisted, cosmic justice kind of way, but I didn't laugh, didn't so much as twitch a muscle in amusement, because I wanted to let this moment stretch, wanted to let her feel the weight of her own words from years past, wanted her to understand, if only for a fleeting second, exactly what it felt like to be small. Mark stood behind me, shifting awkwardly, his hands buried in his pockets, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the tension in his neck, and I knew this was killing him, knew he wanted to step in, to fix things, to play the role of the good son. But this wasn't his decision to make, not this time, not after everything they had done, after everything they had said, after all the times they had dismissed me, belittled me, called me cheap while expecting me to foot the bill for their reckless indulgences. Patricia's eyes darted to mine, and in that moment I saw something I had never seen before: fear. Not just fear of losing her home, her possessions, her lifestyle, but fear of me, fear of what I might say, of what I might do, of the power I suddenly held in my hands. And then, as if realizing that groveling might not be enough, she tried a different tactic, softening her expression, forcing a watery smile as she reached out as if to touch my arm. "We're family, Sarah," she said, her voice trembling just enough to sound authentic, though I knew better than to believe she meant a single word. "And family takes care of each other, right?" I had to give her credit for the effort, for the performance, for the way she had seamlessly shifted from desperation to manipulation in the blink of an eye, but I had spent far too long playing this game to fall for it now. She looked at me like I was her dearest friend, as if she hadn't spent years tearing me down behind my back, as if she hadn't made it abundantly clear time and time again that she thought I wasn't worthy of her son, as if she hadn't once said that Mark could have done better than marrying someone who came from nothing. Mark, who had been silent up until that moment, finally found his voice, though it was hesitant, unsure, laced with conflict he didn't know how to resolve. "Should we help?" he asked, looking at me with something that almost resembled hope, as if he already knew the answer, but wanted to believe I might say something different. I didn't answer right away, just took my time, turning back toward the kitchen to pour myself a cup of coffee, adding just the right amount of cream, stirring it slowly, deliberately, savoring the moment for exactly what it was. Then, finally, I took a sip, letting the warmth spread through me as I turned back to face them, a slow smile creeping onto my lips. And I said nothing at all. I let the silence stretch between us, let it settle thick and heavy in the air, watching Patricia shift uncomfortably as she realized she no longer had control of the conversation, no longer had the upper hand, no longer had the power she had wielded so effortlessly for so many years. The old Patricia, the one who threw elaborate dinner parties and wore diamonds the size of walnuts, would have never found herself in this position, standing in my home with nowhere else to turn. reduced to nothing more than a desperate woman begging for scraps from the very person she had spent years mocking. I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the warmth, enjoying the way her expression twisted from shock to disbelief, and then, just for a moment, something close to panic. I could see her mind working, trying to figure out how to spin this, how to manipulate the situation in her favor, how to regain even the smallest bit of control. But there was no control to be had, not anymore, because for once in her life, Patricia Hawthorne had nothing left to leverage, nothing left to offer, nothing left to hold over me. Then, finally, I smiled. Not a big smile, not a cruel one, just a small, knowing, satisfied smirk, the kind that said, "I remember everything and I will never forget." "Nah," I said casually, as if I were declining a second helping of dessert rather than condemning her to the very fate she had never imagined for herself. They always said I was cheap, wouldn't want to disappoint them. You could have heard a pin drop in the silence that followed, the kind of silence that didn't just fill the room, but pressed against the walls, thick with the weight of unspoken truths and years of carefully hidden resentment. Mark flinched beside me, shifting his weight as if he wanted to step in, to say something, to smooth things over, but even he knew there was nothing to be said, no way to undo the moment that had just unfolded. Patricia's face went pale, her lips parting as if to protest, to argue, to plead, but no words came at first, just the wide-eyed shock of a woman who had never once been denied in her entire life. "You don't mean that," she finally managed, though her voice lacked its usual confidence, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing, as if the idea of someone like me standing up to someone like her was simply incomprehensible. "Oh, but I do," I said smoothly, taking another sip of coffee, letting the bitterness roll over my tongue, as satisfying as victory itself. She let out a breathless, disbelieving laugh, shaking her head as if this were all some kind of misunderstanding, as if I would come to my senses at any moment, as if the woman she had spent years belittling would suddenly remember her place and offer up exactly what she wanted. "Sarah," she started, her voice taking on that forced sweetness she always used when she was trying to manipulate someone, the same voice she had used when she had called me family just days before, when she had tried to convince me that I owed her something simply because I had married her son. "I know we've had our differences, but you can't seriously be saying that you're going to let us struggle like this." I tilted my head, pretending to think about it, even though my decision had already been made long ago, long before they ever needed my help, long before they ever thought they would have to beg me for anything. "I'm not letting you struggle," I said after a long pause, my tone light, almost amused. "I'm just finally respecting your opinion of me. You always said I was too cheap to be generous, right? Well, I'd hate to prove you wrong now." She let out a strangled noise, a mixture of frustration and disbelief, her hands clenching at the expensive handbag she still carried like a security blanket, even though the life she once had was slipping away faster than she could grasp. "This isn't fair," she blurted, her voice rising, cracking at the edges, losing the composure she had once prided herself on. "We're family, Sarah, and you're just going to turn your back on us?" I almost laughed at the audacity of it, the sheer hypocrisy of a woman who had spent years making it clear that I was not truly part of her family, now standing in front of me, demanding that I suddenly accept that label when it was convenient for her. Funny, I mused, setting my coffee cup down with deliberate slowness, watching the way her eyes flicked to it, as if she could see the metaphor in it, the weight of my final decision. "You never seemed to think we were family when it actually mattered." She opened her mouth again, but this time, no words came. For the first time in her life, Patricia Hawthorne had nothing left to say. Mark, who had been silent throughout the entire exchange, finally cleared his throat, his expression caught somewhere between guilt and reluctant understanding. "Mom," he said quietly, shifting beside me, his hands tucked into his pockets, his voice heavy with something close to exhaustion. "Maybe we should go." Patricia turned to him, her eyes wild, her last hope clinging to the son she had always expected to clean up her messes, to step in and do what needed to be done. Mark, she breathed, her voice barely above a whisper, her desperation creeping in at the edges, her carefully constructed image shattering piece by piece. You're really going to let this happen? Mark hesitated, his gaze flicking toward me, searching for something, some kind of answer, some kind of permission, but I gave him nothing, just waited, just let him make his own choice. Let him decide whether he was going to be the son who always obeyed or the man who finally saw things for what they were. And then, slowly, he exhaled, his shoulders slumping, his head dipping in quiet resignation. "Come on, Mom," he said, his voice softer now, gentler, but still firm, still final. "It's time to go." Patricia made a small, broken sound, something I had never thought I would hear from her, something that almost sounded like defeat, like the realization that, for once, she wasn't going to get what she wanted. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she straightened her shoulders, smoothed down the front of her designer coat, and turned toward the door, her chin lifted, her pride clinging to her like a dying ember. She didn't look back as she stepped outside, didn't say another word, didn't try one last time to change my mind. And as I watched her leave, watched the woman who had once ruled over everything she touched walk away with nothing, I felt something settle deep within me, something I hadn't even realized I had been waiting for. I finally felt free. Patricia and William ended up moving in with some distant cousin neither of them had ever particularly liked, a woman named Eleanor who had never quite fit into the pristine world they had built for themselves, but who had just enough money and just enough pity to open her doors when no one else would. The whispers started almost immediately, the quiet, cruel murmurs that spread through their old social circle like wildfire, slipping from one cocktail party to the next, passed along in hushed voices and knowing glances. The Hawthorns were broke, the great and mighty William and Patricia, who had once looked down their noses at everyone they deemed beneath them, were now nothing more than cautionary tales, whispered warnings of what could happen when wealth was mistaken for invincibility. At first, I think they tried to keep up appearances, tried to pretend that things weren't as bad as they seemed, that this was just a temporary setback, a minor inconvenience, something they would overcome with dignity and tact. But the world they had once ruled had no patience for weakness, no sympathy for those who fell from grace, and one by one, the invitations stopped coming, the phone calls became less frequent. The people they had once considered friends slowly but surely distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with the kind of failure that might be contagious. I didn't ask Mark if he had spoken to them, and he didn't volunteer the information, but every so often, I would catch him staring at his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen as if debating whether to call, to check in, to do something, anything, to ease the guilt that still lingered in his chest. But he never did, never reached out, never caved to the weight of obligation they had spent his entire life drilling into him, and I knew, even if he couldn't bring himself to say it out loud, that some part of him understood, deep down, that this was the way it had to be. One evening, as we were driving home, we found ourselves passing by their old house, the grand estate that had once been their kingdom, the home where Patricia had hosted her endless charity events, where William had once laughed at the thought of ever losing anything of real value. But the house didn't belong to them anymore, had been sold off in a desperate attempt to salvage whatever they could, and now someone else lived there, someone who had no idea of the power that property had once symbolized, no knowledge of the pride and arrogance that had seeped into every corner of that mansion like a disease. Mark sighed, the sound heavy, tired, laced with something that wasn't quite sadness, but wasn't quite relief either. He stared at the house for a long moment, as if seeing it for the first time, as if realizing, truly realizing, that the life his parents had once built had never been as stable as they had wanted him to believe. Then, without turning to look at me, he exhaled slowly and said, "You were right." I didn't respond immediately, didn't need to, because we both knew this wasn't about being right, wasn't about winning some petty argument or proving a point. This was about something bigger, about the choices people made and the consequences they had to live with, about the difference between entitlement and responsibility, about knowing when to stand your ground and when to walk away. I reached across the console, found his hand, and squeezed it gently, a silent acknowledgement, a quiet reassurance, a reminder that no matter how complicated things had become, no matter how much had changed, we were still here, still standing, still moving forward. And just like that, I was finally free from their judgments, their entitlement, their hypocrisy, from the years of biting my tongue, of forcing a smile, of pretending I didn't hear their whispers when they thought I wasn't listening. And damn, did it feel good.